Retro 2004. One of the most interesting years in mobile phone design, 2004 saw some iconic handsets and also some heroic failures which might just have changed the mobile world for the better if they'd taken off. Motorola. Motorola had a promising year in 2004, breaking new ground in both 3G and fashion phone markets. The most iconic phone of 2004, and possibly one of the most iconic phones of all time, was the Motorola Razr V3, a striking aluminium-clad design which was notable for its very slim form factor, although the user interface was notably horrible to use. The Razr turned around Motorola's flagging fortunes, but a fixation with this type of design almost killed the company. Motorola was also one of the leaders in the 3G market. The Motorola A1000 was a touchscreen smartphone with GPS that came out 3 years before Apple entered the arena. But 3G sales didn't really take off until much later, and Motorola seemed to lose interest in this market sector. It wasn't helped by the fact that the biggest 3G network in Europe, Hutchison 3, only allowed access to a limited number of walled garden sites rather than the whole web. Back in 2003, Windows Mobile was still thought to be the next big thing, and the Motorola MPX 220 combined Windows with the then popular clamshell form factor to come up with a device that looks very strange these days. Despite the clever packaging, it failed to sell in any significant numbers and was plagued with hardware problems. A rather unusual form factor is present in the Motorola V80, with a rotating display that did win quite a few fans. It certainly stood out against Motorola's usual offerings. Despite these innovations, most of Motorola's sales during 2004 came from their V500 and V600 series of clamshell phones, which showed some attractive designs, but they still lacked the ease of use of their main rival, Nokia. From a 2011 perspective, Motorola have struggled to remain a player, and are now currently almost exclusively active in high-end Android devices. Nokia. Coming out of a miserable 2003, Nokia spent 2004 trying to win back market share with a scattergun approach to models and designs. Nokia broke with tradition in many respects, something that we're seeing echoed with its struggles in 2011. At the top end of the market, the Nokia 9500 communicator offered a big screen and QWERTY keyboard, a new version of Symbian and Wi-Fi, but for some reason lacked 3G support. The brick-like design and weight put all but the most dedicated customers off, and surprisingly it took Nokia 3 years to replace it. A much smaller version, initially without Wi-Fi, the Nokia 9300 was launched the same year, and it proved to be a popular device despite a lack of high-speed data support. Launched at roughly the same time as the 9500, the Nokia 7710 touchscreen phone was ahead of its time, to the point that the technology couldn't really deliver what users actually wanted. A lack of 3G and a frankly pretty awful display killed off Nokia's touchscreen efforts, and it took 4 years for them to revisit the market with the Nokia 5800. Handheld gaming consoles are pretty popular these days, but back in 2004, Nokia were also trying to get into the market. A follow-up to the original N-Gage console, the Nokia N-Gage QD, was more compact and focused on games. It's another one of those frustrating cases where the state of contemporary technology wasn't really up to it, and Nokia gave up this approach shortly afterwards. Despite a lack of 3G in some other high-end devices, Nokia was certainly pushing ahead here with the chubby Nokia 6630. Again, 3G customers were few and far between, but the 6630 was a popular choice for those customers who were using those fledgling 3G networks. Sometimes companies like to experiment, and in the case of the Nokia 7610, Nokia certainly went to town. Trying to break free of the sort of boring monoblock design that Nokia were known for, you know, the sort of phones that people actually bought, Nokia came up with the radical sweeping design of the 7610. The really weird keyboard looked interesting, but the layout was off-putting and was a distraction from the fact that this was a very capable device for its day. Nokia later replaced the keyboard with the supposedly more sober Nokia 6670, which somehow managed to look even uglier. Also in the weird design club was the Nokia 2650, a short-lived cross between a phone and a sun lounger. A simple and quite usable device, the strange design was certainly eye-catching if nothing else. Novel materials also found themselves into the design of the metal-clad Nokia 6170. Sadly a pretty basic device underneath, the 6170 is probably one of the best Nokia handsets that we can remember. Another smart design, this time with a smartphone underneath, was the Nokia 6260. A Symbian device with a swivelling screen in a clamshell form factor, the 6260 was certainly interesting to look at. Clamshells were very popular during 2004, although they are quite rare today. One of the most radical Nokia designs ever was the Nokia 7280 pen phone. Lacking a keyboard, the 7280 was mostly controlled through a rotator and had a small display hidden behind mirrored glass. The pen phone format died out, and these devices are now quite collectible, although perhaps still not very usable. A sibling to the 7280, the Nokia 7260 was a device that we hated at the time, but in these days of black slabby touchscreen phones, the 7260 is at least interesting to look at. It was an enormously popular phone, although even at the time it was depressingly basic underneath the radical exterior. Another popular phone, the Nokia 3220, was aimed at the mass market, but in a funkier package than its predecessors. A good combination of interesting design, lightweight, and low cost led to this being a very strong seller. Not every Nokia was a radical design. The Nokia 6610i managed to combine dull looks with a pretty unrewarding user experience and a rubbish stills camera tacked onto the back. However, this unappealing and unloved device still managed to sell quite well, usually to corporate and business customers. Sony Ericsson. Founded in 2001, Sony Ericsson were beginning to get into their stride by 2004, with some technically advanced and stylish designs. However, as with Motorola, Sony Ericsson have struggled in recent years, partly due to losing focus with dozens of Walkman phones, and now focus mainly on high-end Android devices. Following on from the P800 and P900, the Sony Ericsson P910 was a UIQ-based Symbian smartphone with a relatively large touchscreen and a tiny QWERTY keypad. It wasn't much of an upgrade over its predecessors, and the lack of 3G or Wi-Fi in an otherwise advanced device spoiled it. Even so, there was very little challenge to Sony Ericsson at the time, although most phones these days are now touchscreen devices. Going to show that Nokia was not the only firm that could come up with attractive mobile phones, the Sony Ericsson T630 followed on from the iconic T610. Again, a basic phone in a pretty package, the T630 was a popular device with a memorable semi-translucent case design. A step up from the T630, the Sony Ericsson K700 marked the beginnings of Sony Ericsson's well-regarded K-series of camera phones, in Swedish, camera with a K. A bit smarter and better specified than most rival Nokias, the K700 was one of Sony Ericsson's best-selling phones up to that point.